Pope Francis' wooden coffin was sealed on Friday night, marking a quiet yet profoundly sacred moment that officially ended the public's opportunity to say goodbye after 3 days of lying in state at the heart of the Vatican. The serene closure of this chapter was witnessed only by a select few during a private ceremony, as a spiritual hush fell over the city that had so intimately been tied to the late pontiff's extraordinary life and legacy. In the days leading up to this solemn rite, a staggering 250,000 people from all walks of life had passed through the grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica. Each step they took echoed with reverence, each glance held a whisper of goodbye, and each moment of silence seemed to speak volumes about the profound impact of the man who once stood at the helm of the Roman Catholic Church. As the first pope to hail from Latin America, and the first Jesuit ever to rise to the papacy, Pope Francis represented a bridge between tradition and transformation, a figure both rooted in faith and propelled by compassion. The rite of sealing his coffin was led with deliberate grace by Cardinal Kevin Farrell, a man uniquely positioned for this deeply symbolic act. As the Cardinal Camerlengo, Farrell is the acting head of the Catholic Church during the sede vacante, the period between pontificates. His own life reflects a journey across borders and callings. Born in Dublin, raised in faith, and eventually called to serve as the Bishop of Dallas before becoming an American citizen and rising through the Vatican's hierarchy. Now, in this moment, he carried the weight of history as he stepped into the sacred duty of honoring a pope who had touched lives across the globe. Farrell, joined by other dignitaries of the Church, orchestrated the final gestures with the kind of spiritual precision only such rites demand. Among them were a Venezuelan archbishop, a Brazilian prelate, the late Pope's trusted secretaries, and notably Cardinal Roger Mahony, a retired archbishop from Los Angeles whose past controversies over handling clerical abuse did not bar him from being listed in an official role for this rite. This inclusion stirred quiet murmurs among those familiar with the more shadowed histories of the Church, but within the solemn confines of the ceremony, all such matters seemed to dissolve into the overwhelming presence of mortality and the sacred. Also present were some of Pope Francis' relatives, whose hearts undoubtedly carried the twin burdens of grief and pride. For them, and for the faithful, this ceremony was more than a ritual, it was a communion of memory and farewell. Behind the closed doors of the Vatican, the rite unfolded with a restrained beauty. The soundscape was modest but evocative. A handful of short hymns, spoken prayers that rose like incense, and a moment of pure, collective silence that wrapped the space in an almost tangible sense of peace. At one point, Cardinal Farrell gently draped a white silk veil across Pope Francis' face. The gesture, heavy with meaning, symbolized both reverence and release, a final curtain upon the stage of a deeply impactful life. He then sprinkled holy water over the late pontiff, a sacred act of cleansing and blessing. This was followed by the placing of several items into the wooden coffin, each one selected not for their grandeur but for their deeply personal and symbolic weight. Among them was the Pope's pallium, the white woolen robe that signified his role as shepherd, coins minted during his papacy reflecting the passage of time and milestones achieved, and a parchment document summarizing the highlights of his tenure, an archival touchstone for the future. The rite came to a close with a hymn to the Virgin Mary, a prayer that rose like a quiet anthem of hope and remembrance. As the final note faded, the chapter of St. Peter's assumed its sacred duty, maintaining a vigil by the body of the late Pope throughout the night. Their presence was not simply a guard of honor but a spiritual safeguard, a chorus of prayer that kept the essence of Pope Francis' service alive even in the stillness of his passing. Beyond the stone walls and ornate thresholds of the basilica, the city of Rome throbbed with a different kind of energy. On Friday afternoon, the streets leading to the Vatican swelled with people. Unlike the earlier days of the week, when the foot traffic was more subdued, Friday brought an influx. The lines grew longer, and yet there was little complaint. People waited patiently, their expressions a mixture of solemnity and quiet gratitude. The day coincided with Italy's Liberation Day, a national public holiday, giving many locals the opportunity to participate in this historic farewell. It also marked the fourth day of national mourning, a poignant confluence of civic and spiritual observances. People had come from nearby cities and remote corners of the world, compelled by the gravity of the moment. Among them was Joana Veiga from Porto, Portugal. Her journey had been long, but her heart was set. She had arrived with her sister early that morning, and when she finally stood before the wooden coffin, all the fatigue of travel seemed to vanish. Her voice trembled as she spoke. It was wonderful to see him. It was very peaceful, calm. Her sister, who had missed an earlier opportunity to see Francis during his visit to Portugal, held her hands tightly and nodded. They were among thousands who had made this journey, driven by love, respect, and the rare chance to be part of a deeply moving chapter in church history. As the day waned and 7 p.m. approached, the basilica's doors closed to the public. The final wave of mourners exited in silence, their hearts full of prayer and memory. Night descended upon the Vatican, and within its ancient walls the preparations for the funeral mass began. The simplicity of Pope Francis' chosen rites stood in contrast to the elaborate traditions of his predecessors. Where once popes had been interred within 3 coffins, cypress, lead, and oak, Francis had chosen one. Just one wooden coffin, plain and unadorned, reflecting the humility that had characterized his entire papacy. This decision was not just a personal preference but a continuation of the message he had lived, that service mattered more than ceremony, that simplicity could carry the weight of the sacred. His funeral was set for Saturday to be held at 10 a.m. local time on the grand steps outside St. Peter's Basilica. The moment would not only mark the official farewell but also the beginning of an ancient church tradition known as the Novendiales. For 9 days following the Pope's death, mourning would continue with daily funeral masses held inside the basilica. Each day would bring new prayers, new faces, and renewed reflections on a papacy that had defied expectations and redefined what it meant to lead from the pulpit of Peter. Even in death, Pope Francis continued to guide. His funeral and the days that followed were more than rites of passage. They were spiritual awakenings, opportunities for both the hierarchy and the laity to remember the transformative power of humility, empathy, and inclusive love. In life, he was the Pope who embraced the marginalized, washed the feet of prisoners, opened the Church's doors wider than ever before, and spoke out courageously on issues like climate change, economic inequality, and human dignity. In death, he had managed to gather the world not with pomp, but with presence. For those who had followed his journey, from Buenos Aires to the Vatican, from the Jesuit halls of learning to the world's most public pulpit, this moment was heavy with both loss and legacy. Pope Francis had been more than a pontiff. He was a shepherd who had walked with his flock, not above them. His memory now etched in the hearts of millions, his voice still echoing in the sacred corridors of faith, and his story continuing to inspire long after the final hymn had been sung and the final prayer had been whispered.